Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Adcom Speak. We are here with Yale Adcom Margie Adler herself. Margie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Margie Adler, and I am Senior Associate Director of Admissions here at the Yale School of Management. And hopefully I will be able to answer most of your questions today about this process. I'm ready for your questions.
All right, sounds good. So I'm just going to head on to the first few admissions-based questions. So as most of our listeners now know that the Yale Round 1 deadline was a few days back. So the anxiety levels are just settling in right now. And because, like I'm very active on the forums, I know that there has been a first wave of interview invites, which has led to a series of, yay, thank God I got an invitation to, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? So just wanted to ask you really quickly, after an applicant hits submit, what really happens in the background?
Yes, it's a very complex process, but please do not despair. I really hope that your anxiety becomes optimism after we have this conversation. So what happens is that we start reviewing applications pretty much right after the application deadline. And we'll go through and we have a committee that looks at the applications, and we start extending invitations to interview very shortly after the application deadline. But if you haven't gotten one yet, please do not despair. It is a long process. We will be extending interview invitations for several weeks, and this will go on until almost up until the decision release date, which is in early December. So some of you may have already received an invitation to interview. They will be going out, as I said, for several weeks to come. So if you haven't already gotten it, please do not despair. We'll be sending them out for the next few weeks up until November.
All right, awesome. I'm glad to hear that, and I hope most of us who are holding on have some breath of fresh air. So I just want to quickly also ask you, like when you send out interview invitations and the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, and so on.
Yes.
So is there a pattern of sending? And our users love to analyze this stuff. So
Right.
is it based on geography, demography, industry, work experience, GMAT scores? So we leave nothing behind. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in general, it's fairly random. So we'll start looking at applications, like I said, right after the application deadline. And we don't usually have any sort of priorities or orders in which we send them out. So it can go out to, people in any industry, in any region, at the same time. So it's just not like that. We just sort of like start as, sort of randomly, and that continues on over the course of several weeks.
So you would recommend not over analyzing the waves?
Right, you really can't, because for example, we probably have already sent out some invitations to candidates in India, or over the past few days, and that will continue on until, as I said, into November.
Okay, great. So just going to move on to a little bit about the application process in general and what Yale really looks for. And this is going to help especially our round 2 applicants and also people who are going to interview. So if you had to, express it in one sentence, like what is Yale really looking for in its applicants, how would you say it?
We're really looking for applicants who have displayed to us primarily academic excellence, as well as career excellence, as well as people who have showed some sort of intellectual curiosity, some sort of broad-mindedness, open-mindedness, and a global outlook.
Okay, awesome. So that's a lot of things. That's a tall order. That's not very easy
to. It is a tall order, right? And which is why we say that we look at the application holistically, because we're looking at every element of the application is meant to give us some indication of some of those things that I just mentioned through your application. So we're looking at your transcripts and your test scores for indications of academic excellence, and we're looking at your resume and your recommendations for career excellence, and we're looking at your video questions and your essays and your resume and the rest of your application for some evidence that you have somehow gone out of your comfort zone, that you're interested in what's going on in the world, that you have displayed some sort of curiosity about people outside of your own immediate surroundings.
All right. Okay. Makes sense. So, I do think people want to articulate all of that, but they only have one essay to do it, right? And that essay has grown in popularity over the last few years. So, how would you recommend a person who wants to really articulate all these brand qualities in those 500 words in the commitment essay? What would be your recommendation?
Well, as I said, it's not only the essay. So we might be getting it from your essay. We might be getting it from your letters of recommendation. There might be some evidence of that on your resume. You may be able to get that into your video questions. So we're looking at all of these all together. So it's not just the essay, but we're really looking at the entire application to understand where you stand on these things.
Awesome. So talking about the essay, I had one question that I get a lot on the forum. So
yeah.
The commitment test is a little different from any other, like professional or personal essay. And
yes.
And we have a lot of consultants who sort of, recommend talking about a personal story, or some of them want to talk about, professional accomplishments. So
right.
Is there something that, you would like to see on the commitment essay coming alive, as opposed to, one of these options?
Right, that's a great question. And it's a difficult question to answer because we really want you to choose what your biggest commitment is, and that can be personal or it can be professional. And it can be a commitment to a person or a thing or an organization or an idea. And we are less concerned with what you choose as your biggest commitment than we are with how you describe how you approach the commitment. So we want to know what commitment means to you. So it's important for you to put in your essay how you approach commitment. Describe to us how you have been committed to the object of that commitment. So that's what we're really looking for, is what commitment means to you and what your approach is to commitment. And that's more important to us than actually what you choose as the thing that you are committed to.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think that's also that's a difficult job, but I think we have been able to get help from Yale directly, and a lot of Yale current students and alums, to how to approach this question. I think a lot of our users are in a better shape than they were last month. So
right. I think you should not really stress too much about what the what it is that your commitment is, because what we're really looking for is what your description of being committed. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions about international applicants. So I'm going to go about them in a bit. But before that, I wanted to check with you about interviewing at Yale. So let's say you got that invite and you're preparing for your interview. So what would you recommend will be the basics of interview prep for Yale?
Right. So definitely the basics, the real basics, like be on time, dress professionally, have a clean copy of your resume ready to give to your interviewer. We do encourage people to come on campus for interviews, but as many of you online will be very far away. We will also be visiting various cities around the world to conduct interviews. These our interview questions are really not things that you can prepare for. They're things that you need to know. But I will say that the person who interviews you, we conduct blind interviews, which means that the person that interviews you will only have seen your resume and not the rest of your application. So you need to be very, very comfortable with what you have on your resume. You need to be prepared to answer questions about anything that's on your resume. I would say probably try and have a couple of career anecdotes available, because there will likely be questions about things that have occurred in your career, and you would want to be able to have some examples prepared. But in general, these are fit interviews, so we're going to be asking you, questions that will help us understand whether or not you would be a good fit in our program. And as well, I would say that you should also be prepared with some questions for us. So, and not things that you can readily find on the website, but questions that really will give us an understanding that you have given this a lot of thought, that you have thought about whether or not you're a good fit, that you have done a lot of research on whether or not this is the right program for you, and that you have put some thought into the process.
Yeah, great. And I think one of the I was there for the Yale information session in Mumbai.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that stood out to me was the integrated curriculum, right?
Yeah.
And I think so if someone wants to talk a little bit about specific things that Yale has to offer,
Yes.
I often hear that there's not much space to talk about that in the application, right? So what would you say to that? Like, is that something for the interview? Would you talk about that in the short answer question? What would you recommend?
Right. So we don't really have a space specifically for that in our application, but you will have an opportunity to talk about that during your interview.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
You don't have to try and shoehorn it into any other part of the application, because you'll have the opportunity to give us that information when we interview you.
Sure. Okay, so talking about shoehorning, so we have this. So the Yale application has this short answer question about career goals.
Yes.
And I remember asking this question when I was in the information session, and I heard this really amazing anecdote that last year in the class of, I think it was 2016, the admissions team gave each one of these graduating students a copy of their goals when they first started off.
Right.
I think that was a hilarious thing to do. So just to talk about goals, like, what do you really look for when someone, articulates their goals, short term and long term, and how do you judge a candidate's, willingness to pursue that goal, or its tying to the Yale MBA program?
Right. Well, so, I mean, obviously people do change their mind when they get here. One of the nice things about an MBA program is that it's an opportunity to explore, and it's an opportunity to try different things, and you get to learn a lot, and you'll be surprised with the things that you'll learn from your classmates, and you'll find out things that, about career paths that maybe you didn't even know existed before. So people do change their mind, and that happens very frequently once you get into the program. But the reason why we ask these goal questions is, again, that we want to know that you have given it serious thought, that you have thought about whether or not this is something that you really need in order to achieve those goals. And so, again, it doesn't really matter to us what those goals are. What we're looking for is the thought process that you've put into it, and whether or not you have actions whether or not you know what the steps that need to be taken to achieve those goals, whether an MBA is really one of those steps, and whether you've thought through that entire process.
So you're saying it's more of a critical reasoning exercise than actually wanting
in
to
a way,
pursue that goal.
In a way it is, right? Because what we want to do is to be able to get a feel for whether or not someone wants to do an MBA because they can't really decide what it is that they really want to do, or whether they've actually really thought through it and have come to the conclusion that an MBA is required for what they want their next step to be.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's really insightful. So I'm going to move on to other aspects of the application. And one of the most challenging things that people really stress about is test scores, right?
Yes.
So, and I think in our forums, we tend to have people with higher test scores. So it's because it's GMAT Club, right? So it's a little of, it's a daunting space to see all these people with, like 730s, 740s, like higher 750s. So, and Yale also has had a pretty steady growth in the average GMAT of its classes
Yes,
every single year. If I'm not wrong, the last year's average was around 728, right? And that's
it's about
astronomical.
yes.
Right. So what would you say about the importance of test scores? And what would you say that, okay, so if you reach the score, you don't need to reapply? Is that a sweet spot like that?
There really isn't, because again, we're not only looking at the score. So the score is important, but it's not the most important thing. So what I'll say about the score is that, yes, our median score is around 730 this year, which you also need to look at the range. So the 80% is between 690 and 760. So you definitely want to be within that range. If you're lower than that range, then the rest of your application is going to have to be that much stronger in order to make up for it. But that does happen. So there are many people who get admitted with lower, who are outside of that range. But, to be safe, you want to try, your goal should be to be within that range. So having said that, the median is 730. So you kind of want to, you want to get to as close as that as possible. But like I said, we're looking at a lot of other things. So if your score, some people are not great at standardized test taking. If your score is lower than you want it to be, then you're going to need to highlight the strengths throughout the rest of your application. So your GPA is going to have to be stronger. Your work experience is going to have to be stronger. You're going to have very strong recommendations and things like that. So, like I said, it is a holistic, that's what we mean when we say that we look at it holistically. So it's not just about the score. The score is definitely important, but it's not the most important thing. A very, very strong score can help to make up for weaknesses in other areas of the application, and as well, a weaker score, then there are other areas of the application that can make up for that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I had a question which is just based on this. So,
Okay.
And I told you this before, I'm a reapplicant myself, and we have a few reapplicants on the forums. So, and one thing that they mentioned is, and this is especially true for international candidates, right? So, okay, so I'm from India. My GPA is, it doesn't look that great on paper, but my grading was really strange. So even though I have a C, but C was probably the highest grade that year. And now and so, the general admissions advice for that person is to explain that in the optional essay, right?
Right.
So, and then, so doing that versus, compensating your GPA with a very high GMAT score, right? So what would you say will have a better impact? That's my first question. And my second question was around, if you are reapplying, you want to, put most of your optional real estate into articulating what you have done to strengthen your candidacy, right? So in
Yes.
that case, would you rather showcase that, hey, I've taken quant courses, or I've improved my GMAT, or would you rather explain your GPA? What would you think would be a wiser strategy?
Right. Well, I think that is depends. It's going to be different for every person. So it depends on what your entire application looks like to begin with. So one thing that I will say for those of you on the line is that, and this is something that maybe not a lot of people know, is that if you do apply and you are denied, you can ask us for feedback on your application, and we'll give you feedback on your application so that we'll be able to point out the areas that we saw as weaknesses on your application, and then you can use that feedback to improve your subsequent reapplication. So that's something to keep in mind. So, to answer your question, it depends on what the weaknesses were to begin with. So if the weakness to begin with was your GMAT, if your GMAT score was on the lower end, then yes, you would probably want to retake the GMAT to try and get a stronger score. If your weakness was in your transcript, then in that case, what you might want to do is take some quantitative courses to try and, give us a better idea of what your quantitative abilities are. I would say also that you can also submit additional recommendations, and you can ask your recommenders to speak to your quantitative abilities, or whatever it is that your feedback showed were your weaknesses in your application. But in general, when you reapply, you want to highlight your strengths and you want to discuss the differences between your last application and the current application.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a pretty tactical piece of advice. I do have a question about low GPA, like one more question about low GPA.
Sure, okay.
So we do tend to have a few people on the forums, and like GMAT Club often constitutes almost 20 to 30% of the incoming class. So we do have quite a pretty sample. So we do have a few people, with low GPAs, like plain and simple. They did not probably do incredibly well in their undergrad. But considering the undergrad was like, on an average 5 to 6 years back, or for some people like decades back,
right.
Do you think a high GMAT score can compensate for that GPA? Or would you say a low GPA is actually much worse than a low GMAT score?
No, actually, I would say that if your GPA is on the lower end, then a high GMAT score will definitely help. And like I mentioned before, what happens in the rest of your application is really important. So for one, you'll need to have some strong work experience. So especially if you're someone who's been out for a while, we want to see on your resume that you have, been promoted. We would like to see very strong recommendations. You can have your, and when you have a recommendation, you want to talk to the recommender beforehand and talk to them about your reasons for wanting to get an MBA, and talk to them about, highlight some of what you think are your, the things that you've done well on your job, and just remind them of some of the accomplishments that you've had. And you can ask them to highlight, let's say, for example, some of the quantitative work that you've done on the job. And that can really go a long way, if you have a very strong recommendation coupled with a very strong GMAT score.
Awesome. Yeah, because that sort of is a worry for a lot of our folks. And it's great to hear some validation. Thank you for sharing that, Margie. Thank you so much. I just also quickly point out that I just wanted to say that I did, as you mentioned, I did reach out to Yale admissions for feedback of my own application. And I actually got really specific feedback. And that really helped me in figuring out what are specific things that I needed to improve. And there were quite a few of them, I'll be honest. So that's great to know as well. So we have covered, undergrad, we have covered test scores, we have covered a little bit of essays, we have also covered interviews. So I wanted to get with like life at the Yale campus, and I think this is where a lot of people. I think one of the reasons why Yale is so popular on our forums is because of current students and alums who had an incredible time in the campus, right?
Yes.
So, and I'm sure you get a firsthand pulse on what student experience is like. So what do you think people enjoy the most within and outside the classroom at the SOM program?
I think what one of the distinguishing features of our program, and the thing that people talk about the most after they leave as alumni, is the community, the collaborative culture. I think because it's a smaller class size than some of the other top programs, that people really do get to know each other very well. And because we have this large emphasis on teamwork, and because we have the smaller class size, I think that people really do collaborate. And it becomes a way of life, and it becomes part of the bonding experience that people go through during the program. And I think that that's what people take away mostly from it. So, obviously the academics are stellar, and people, the career development office does a great job with helping people land exactly the type of job that they want. But I think that when people leave, what they remember is the feeling that they had, the friendships that they made, the work that they did while they were here. And I think all of that is just part of the culture of being here at SOM, and that's what people talk about afterwards. And if you talk to some of the alumni, that's probably one of the first things that they'll mention.
Yeah, and we have had exactly the same things that you're talking about. I think the community plays a large role in boosting the popularity of Yale that we have been seeing on the forums. So I know that we have almost like 3 minutes left on the clock. So I just wanted to quickly add a little bit about financial aid, because I know a lot of Yale applicants come from very underdeveloped countries and they can't afford to pay a full MBA tuition, right? So what are the financial aid opportunities do you have on the Yale campus, and what other opportunities can people leverage if they want that full flagship MBA program?
Yes, well, so as you know, we do not offer need-based scholarships. So we don't take your financial situation into account when we are taking part in the admission process, but we do offer merit-based scholarships. And so we are generally looking at, our financial aid office looks at the sort of overall highest profiles, and a fairly large percentage of our students will receive a merit-based scholarship. And those can be anywhere from $5,000 a year to full tuition for both years. So you find out what kind of scholarship you got when you get your admission decision. For those people who do not get scholarships, or if their scholarships don't cover the entire cost of their tuition and fees, then there are loan programs, and there are loan programs that, we work with specific loan vendors. There are loan programs that are for domestic and for international candidates. So it's usually pretty straightforward, particularly for international candidates to acquire loans that will finance, the entire 2 years minus whatever sort of merit scholarship that they've gotten. And our financial aid office is very, very helpful in helping you through the loan process.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm pretty sure a lot of, I can speak for Indians. I think that's also one of the major concerns of going for an MBA program. And I do see a lot of financial aid options at Yale, and a lot of other loan options as well. So I'm going to bring this chat to a close. It was really great chatting with you in the morning. I'm sorry for the Eastern and Pacific time mix-up, but
no problem.
I really had a great time. And if you do get the chance to, just sneak around the GMAT Club forums, that'll be great as well. A lot of us will appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you and all of the GMAT Club members. I wish you all well with your applications. Please do not hesitate to reach out. You can contact me directly at margie.adler@yale.edu if you have any further questions. And again, thank you so much for listening, and have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Margie. I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.